by design or otherwise, Taibbi this morning posted to Twitter a new installment of the Twitter files that contains some of the most important revelations yet. In particular, the object of his reporting is the thing that I have spent a great deal of time on reporting on as part of my own written journalism, as part of the show, which is the scam disinformation industry. This network of groups that are funded either by the US and Western intelligence agencies or by the same two liberal billionaires, namely George Soros and Pierre Omidyar. They all bear very benign sounding names like the Alliance for Securing Democracy or the Atlantic Council or the Center for Combating Extremism. And what they claim they're intending to do is to identify disinformation and combat it, when in reality all they're really doing is trying to disguise a very politicized agenda, a politicized censorship agenda, as some sort of science. That these are experts who have somehow become experts in identifying disinformation, and therefore these are the people who big tech should rely upon when deciding what views are and are not permitted on the internet. Taibbi's revelations that come right from the files of Twitter shine a great deal of light on how this network functions and specifically on how to identify them. So let's take a look before we get to the hearing at what he was able to show today. Here we see on the screen the first tweet, which he entitled Twitter Files Statement to Congress, and he calls it the Censorship-Industrial Complex, which is really what it is. It's an industry that 10 years ago did not exist. After the 2016 election, when the Democrats were humiliated by losing to essentially a host of a game show on television because they ran the most unpopular candidate, presidential candidate in 2 generations, Hillary Clinton. Instead of accepting responsibility for their defeat, they sought out villains and culprits to explain why they lost. And among the long list of villains, the Russians, James Comey, WikiLeaks, Jill Stein, the media, they really concluded that free speech on the internet was something they could no longer tolerate. And they needed to find a way to pretty up and beautify and disguise what their real intention and their agenda became. Not an ancillary agenda, but central to their tactics, which was to start censoring and policing the internet. And they knew, given the values of free speech with which as Americans we're all inculcated from childhood, that they couldn't just be blunt about it. They couldn't just say we're censoring the internet because we want to exclude people who are challenging our agenda from being heard. So what they instead set out to do was to finance and concoct a brand new expertise that is a complete fraud. People who suddenly proclaim themselves disinformation experts. And then they got their allied billionaires like George Soros and Pierre Omidyar, or sometimes just the US security state itself or MI6, to finance directly or indirectly through the National Endowment of Democracy and quasi-government agencies like those, a whole variety of groups that purported to employ disinformation experts whose goal was to identify disinformation. And in all cases, the disinformation they identify is always views or ideas or stories that undermine global neoliberal institutions of power, the Democratic Party, narratives propagated by the large media, the corporate media in the United States and throughout the West. It's a political movement that pretends to be based on science. It's funded by the same people, by the government, and their goal is basically explicit: to encourage and pressure and coerce big tech to censor from the internet any dissent to the Democratic Party, to the US security state, and to neoliberal institutions, international neoliberal institutions, not by admitting that they're censoring dissent, but by claiming that they're only censoring what they have identified as disinformation. And so often what they claim is disinformation is actually completely true, and what they claim is true is actually disinformation. These are the same people who told you that the reporting of Joe Biden's business activities in Ukraine and China right before the election should be ignored because it was Russian disinformation. They're the people who told you that it was disinformation to wonder whether the coronavirus came from a leak from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. They're the same people who claimed it was disinformation to question the US and NATO proxy war in Ukraine. Whatever subverts or undermines their agenda and the agenda of those that finance them gets labeled disinformation, mostly so that they can censor the internet and propagate their own disinformation without being challenged. So this is what Taibbi calls it after having spent a lot of time looking through the files. And he gives an example here in which they are acknowledging that some of what they want censored is not even information they consider disinformation. It's information they acknowledge is true, but that has bad consequences in their view. So one example here, and you can see it on the screen, it's called, quote, true content which might promote vaccine hesitancy. This was part of what they wanted censored. Information that was true, but that could make people more hesitant to take the COVID vaccine. And examples were, quote, viral posts of individuals expressing vaccine hesitancy, or stories of true vaccine side effects, true posts which could fuel hesitancy, such as individual countries banning certain vaccines. These were all things they wanted censored, things they admitted were true, but that undermined their agenda. That's a major revelation, that these groups were acknowledging that they were trying to get things censored that not even they were pretending was disinformation. Here in the next tweet, he writes, quote, Twitter was more like a partner to the government. While other tech firms, with other tech firms, Twitter held a regular, quote, industry meeting with FBI and Homeland Security and developed a formal system for receiving thousands of content reports from every corner of government, HHS, Treasury, NSA, even the local police. And here you see a variety of emails where those, not just U.S. security state agencies like Homeland Security and the NSA, but the Treasury Department and the Health and Human Services Department were sending requests/demands to Twitter saying, here are all the posts we want removed. They had an open channel to do that. It was disguised as a Twitter censorship program that in reality was being directed by government agencies. These are all things we've known before. These are all things that have been reported before. It's the reason so many Democrats hate Matt Taibbi and the other journalists who worked on these files for the crime of exposing a censorship regime they support and the role of these agencies that they revere in the censorship regime. But what he today focused on and expanded the lens to include is this industry of disinformation experts, which I use scare quotes for. I'm at the point where I genuinely believe, it's not hyperbole, that any individual identifying themselves as a disinformation expert or an anti-misinformation activist or any groups that label themselves as having among their mission the combating of disinformation, those groups should be held with extreme amounts of suspicion. In almost every case, those groups are the groups that want to disseminate disinformation, not combat it. And their attempt to censor is an attempt to shield their disinformation campaigns from being questioned and challenged in a meaningful way. I personally, when I see somebody identifying as a disinformation expert or a journalist claiming they work on the disinformation beat, I automatically assume that they're frauds. In large part because there is no such thing as a disinformation expertise. That is a fake expertise. Where did that come from? You can study cardiology. You can study how to be a pilot. You can study to be an aeronautical engineer. These are all real expertise. These are things that are actually things that you can go and learn and have a greater capability than people who haven't studied it on how to do it. But there is no such thing as a person trained in an apolitical way to recognize disinformation. These groups aren't financed by the US government and liberal billionaires because these liberal billionaires and the US government just want a world filled with greater truth. You're going to see a Democratic congressman who defended at this House hearing this censorship regime by claiming what I just mockingly said with a straight face. That our friends in the US security state just want to protect us from disinformation. That's why they're participating in censorship. And he told Matt Taibbi that he should have a tinfoil hat on if he believes otherwise. So here you see the evidence of how this disinformation industry works. Here are more emails that Taibbi included in his tweet that are just email after email after email from government agencies with a long list of Twitter users or tweets they want banned or removed. Here, for example, is one of the FBI agents whose name is Elvis Chan, who was apparently responsible for being the go-between between the FBI and Twitter, because he was almost on a daily basis sending to Yoel Roth and to other Twitter executives things that he wanted censored. And here's his list of issues on which he wanted censorship to take place. He said, please forward to whomever you deem appropriate. It's about an FBI meeting with Twitter. It's dated, this is the date is today's date when Taibbi published it. But the email date you see here is July 30th, 2020. So just a few months before the 2020 election, they were very active in trying to get information censored off Twitter. The US government, the security state, was interfering in our political discourse very directly and actively. Here you see they had issues of censorship they wanted with regard to the Russia, China, global status, including Iran, Venezuela, and North Korea, and planning for the election. So they were explicitly meeting, the FBI was, with Twitter to direct them on how to censor in anticipation of the coming 2020 election. Now here is where Taibbi expands the scope to include these private disinformation groups. He says, quote, we came to think of this grouping, state agencies like DHS, FBI, or the Global Engagement Center, along with, quote, NGOs that aren't academic and an unexpectedly aggressive partner, namely the commercial news media, as the censorship-industrial complex. That's something I omitted to note, which is that a critical part of this network, of this axis of set power centers that are devoted in secret, or previously in secret, until the Twitter files exposed it, to censoring the internet is the corporate media. They constantly are writing to Twitter and Facebook and Google, pressuring them to censor information that they think violates the terms of service of these platforms. Imagine being a journalist, someone who goes into journalism, and then having as your function being a leading agitator for demanding that political content be removed from the internet. And yet that's what so many of these journalists, these corporate journalists, have as their primary function. Here in the next tweet. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update. Catch our full shows for free, live weekdays at 7 p.m. Eastern on Rumble, and join our locals community at greenwald.locals.com for all of my written journalism, exclusive after-show Q&As, and more.